If your car breaks down tomorrow, there's one number that decides what happens next. Not your salary, not your credit score, just how much cash you can put your hands on today without borrowing a cent. For 1 in 5 American adults, that number is under $100. This isn't a video about that number. It's about the machine behind it, the one deciding, quietly, who has room to breathe and who doesn't. And it hides in plain sight, inside a survey the Federal Reserve runs every single year. In 2025, 73% of American adults told the Fed they were doing okay or living comfortably. That number has barely moved since 2022. At first glance, stability, but averages are built to hide distance. Take 10 households. 9 have $1,000 saved. 1 has nothing. The average is $900. Nobody in that group actually has $900. The average exists, the person does not. The 73% works the same way. 86% of adults with a bachelor's degree said they were doing okay. Among adults without a high school diploma, 41% did. 83% of adults over 60 said they were fine. 63% of adults under 30 said the same. 73% isn't a description of the country. It's the empty space between these groups, describing none of them. And when the Fed asked people to rate the national economy instead of their own life, only about 1 in 4 called it good. People feel okay about themselves. They do not feel okay about the system underneath them. That contradiction is the entire video. Employment looked solid in 2025. Underneath, it was softening. Layoffs rose. Voluntary quits fell to their lowest in years. And that combination is the tell. People aren't quitting because they're not confident they'll find something better. New job starts fell too, even though the number of people applying didn't change. People are trying just as hard to move up. They're succeeding less. Young adults absorbed the worst of it, 3 times more likely than adults over 30 to be out of work and unable to find a job. Even the technology reshaping this labor market split along the same line. 1 in 4 workers used generative AI last month, but that was 43% of workers with a graduate degree against 10% of workers with a high school diploma or less. The same tool, adopted along the exact same fault line that splits everything else in this report. Work is the first filter in this machine. It decides who enters the rest of this video with a cushion, and who enters it already exposed. Before bills and credit, there's a cost that never shows up on a pay stub. Raising a child. The median weekly childcare payment in 2025 was $250, $350 for families using 20 or more hours a week. Compare that to housing, most families' single largest expense. Median monthly childcare payments came out to over half of the median rent or mortgage payment for the same families. Childcare is functionally a second rent payment, and it isn't split evenly. Among couples living with young children, 58% of mothers said they were the primary caretaker. 12% of fathers said the same. 37% of mothers with young children weren't working for pay at all. Every hour spent on unpaid care is income that never entered the household to begin with. It's the same machine, just running through a different door. Now the money that does come in and how unreliably it arrives. 30% of adults said their income varied month to month. For 11% of all adults, that variability caused real hardship. Self-employed adults felt it hardest. 58% had variable income, and 22% said it caused them to fall behind. Meanwhile, spending kept outrunning income. 35% of adults said their spending rose over the past year. Only 32% said their income did. 77% made some kind of trade-off just to keep pace, cutting back, delaying, draining savings. And when the math still didn't work, people turned to each other. 23% of adults got help from someone outside their household to cover an expense last year. Among adults under 30, that was 47%, nearly half a generation, quietly subsidized by parents managing this exact same pressure. None of this is a personal failure. It's the machine working exactly as designed, moving pressure sideways until it lands somewhere with no more room left to move. 59% of adults had at least one major unexpected expense in the past year: a vehicle repair, a home or appliance repair, a major medical bill. Most weren't small, typically landing between $1,000 and $2,000. That's exactly the range 18% of adults couldn't cover with savings at all. The hardship compounds from there. 16% of adults didn't pay all their bills in full last month. 26% skipped medical care because of cost. 8% said someone in their household sometimes didn't have enough to eat. Among people who faced a shock, 41% went on to experience one of these hardships. Among people who didn't, only 28% did. The shock isn't the problem. It's the test that reveals whether a household had any room left to absorb it. This is where our opening number comes back. 63% of adults said they could cover a hypothetical $400 expense with cash or its equivalent, unchanged for 3 years. But the Fed asked a sharper version. Not would you, but what's the actual largest expense you could handle right now, using only what's already yours. 18% said under $100. That's the honest number, not 63% with a comfortable cushion. Closer to 30% of the country with almost nothing between them and a bad week. Savings isn't a personality trait in this data. It's a symptom of how much room a household had to begin with. 20% of adults reported financial fraud in 2025. Setting aside credit card fraud, which consumers usually aren't liable for, the damage nationally came to an estimated $100 billion. $56 billion of it never recovered. Here is where our number returns. Among adults earning under $50,000 a year, the median amount lost to non-credit card fraud was $400, the exact same number. Once it was the line between surviving a bad week and not. Now, it's the median amount stolen from the people least able to afford losing it. 40% of that same income bracket couldn't cover even a $100 emergency using savings. The machine doesn't just fail to protect these households. Something in the system finds them anyway. 82% of adults had a credit card in 2025. 45% carried a balance at least once. Nearly half the country paying interest on unpaid debt. Total U.S. credit card balances hit an all-time high, $1.2 trillion. That number tells you the size of the system. It doesn't tell you who's carrying it. This does. Adults living comfortably saw their average balance rise 1% in 2 years. Adults finding it difficult to get by saw their balance rise 37%. The struggling minority accounted for 65% of the entire national increase. Access to credit isn't equal either. Some groups were denied at more than double the rate of others. When traditional credit gets harder to reach, cheaper-looking alternatives appear. 16% of adults used Buy Now, Pay Later last year. Here's what most users don't know. Over a third believe it builds their credit history. At the time of this survey, none of the 3 major credit bureaus counted it toward a score at all. The product looks like credit. It functions like something else entirely. And the gap between those two things is exactly where people get hurt, quietly, months later. Every pressure in this video eventually collides with the one expense that can't be delayed forever: a place to live. 63% of adults owned their home, but ownership tracked income almost perfectly. 86% among the highest earners, just 33% among the lowest. The median mortgage payment was $1,600 a month. Rent itself has gotten harder to keep up with. 23% of renters fell behind at some point in 2025, up from 17% in 2021. Among renters earning under $25,000, that number was 33%. Among renters earning over $100,000, 5%. Housing is the floor this entire system sits on. In 2025, that floor cracked fastest under exactly the households with the least room left to fall. None of this data was hidden. It sat in the same survey, the same tables, the same $400 question, asked from 2 directions, year after year. A 73% well-being number can describe a country. It cannot describe the mother who left the workforce because childcare cost more than she earned, or the renter one missed paycheck from falling behind. A $1.2 trillion balance can describe a market. It cannot tell you that 65% of its growth sat on the shoulders of the minority already struggling. So what was this system actually optimized for? Not household protection. Continuity. Keep the paychecks moving. Keep access to credit alive for everyone, regardless of what that access costs them later. For a household with room to spare, that access is opportunity, and debt is temporary. For a household with none left, the exact same access becomes necessity, and debt becomes permanent weight. Same architecture, different sentence, depending only on where you happen to enter it. The $400 number hasn't moved in years. That was never the risk. The risk was always the question nobody asked while it stayed still. Stable for whom?